Hey, listeners, before we get started today, I want to give a quick shout out and word to our sponsor, our very first sponsor, Rapido Solutions Group. Danny Frisco and Roberto Icaza, two longtime friends of mine, guys I've known for 10 plus years, the CEO and COO respectively and co-founders of Rapido Solutions Group. These guys know what they're doing. I'm excited to be partnered with them to give you a little glimpse into their business. Rapido connects logistics and supply chain organizations in North America with the best nearshore talent to scale efficiently, operate on par with US-based teams, and deliver superior customer service. These guys work with businesses from all sides of the industry, 3PLs, carriers, logistics, software companies, whatever it may be. They'll build out a team and support whatever roles you need, whether it's customer, carrier sales support, back office, or tech services. These guys know logistics. They know people. It's what sets them apart in this industry. They're driven by an inside knowledge of how to recruit, hire, and train within the industry and a passion to build better solutions for success. In the current market conditions where everyone is trying to be more efficient, do more with less, nearshoring is the latest and greatest tactic that companies are deploying to do so, and Rapido is a tremendous solution for you. So check them out at gorapido.com, and thank you again for being a sponsor to our show, a great partner. We look forward to working with you. And to our listeners, that's it. Let's get the show on the road. Hello, freight friends. We are back with another episode of the Freight Pod. I'm your host, Andrew Silver, and for the first time, well, not the first time, the second time, I guess we did this with Convoy, but we've got multiple guests. We're doing a panel. So I got the feedback from people to try to change things up a little bit, and frankly, I came back from a conference where I moderated a panel with a few CEOs, and I just liked having multiple people sharing perspective. I'm hoping for some intense arguments here, like metaphorical fisticuffs, and I want to see these guys going at it. So I am joined today by three of the industry's finest, especially as pertains to their history on the carrier side of the business and the experience that they've had. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Mr. Blair Blake? Give us kind of your background, your career journey, and especially touch on some of the carrier history there and kind of what you're doing today.
Absolutely. Great to be here. So I'm Blair Blake, VP of Carrier Strategy at Arrive. Prior to Arrive, I cut my teeth at Command Transportation on the carrier side starting in 2008. Once the news came out about the M&A between, Command and Echo, I think that was in 2015, I decided it would be a perfect time in my career to take a chance and started a brokerage with a few other colleagues. That was called Forefront Logistics. After about, I'd say 15 months into that journey, we found ourselves in a profitable position and naturally started thinking about, growth opportunities. Being really naive, we sent a LinkedIn message to a company whose business objective was to really create self-driving stacks and ultimately self-driving trucks for the long haul portion of shipments. Not really expecting much. We did get an outreach back that evening and really wanted to talk and discuss about brokerage overall. Long story short, that transitioned into an M&A and went to start a company called Uber Freight. After going through that experience for about 4.5 years, I decided that it was important to try to get some additional exposure. I went up and started a produce shipper, or joined a produce shipper rather, and for lack of a better term, helped manage their shipper freight with an in-house transportation team. Andrew, I think this is where our careers have very direct intersections and ultimately how we became connected. After about a year and a half at the produce shipper, I made a decision to explore some other brokerages. I really wanted to find someone who had a couple of years under their belt, but were maybe looking to transition into that, true growth and economies of scale phase. So ultimately, that's what led me to Arrive. And over the last, 4.5 years, I've spent my time really focusing on ways to improve business efficiency on the carrier side, That comes down to people, process, and technology in summary.
What people don't know is the very same produce shipper that you first partnered with to start your brokerage was the one that I did. And I guess it didn't quite work out for either of us with them. But I was glad to get to meet you through that. And I'm happy to have you here today. So let's move to Jay Gustafson. Why don't you go ahead and give us your background?
Well, first off, I'm just going to say, Blair, I'm happy that you didn't mention me as the reason you didn't stay with Command after the Echo acquisition, because that wouldn't have been a good way to start, today's discussion. But appreciate you having me on, Andrew. I started my career back in '04. Actually, yesterday was my 20-year anniversary in the logistics space. I started as an intern at AFN in my junior year of college. Loved the industry, loved the fast-paced nature of it. Spent my first 4 years at AFN, couple years in carrier sales, couple years in carrier management. Then got the opportunity to join Echo in 2008 to be the first truckload carrier sales manager. At the time, they were very focused on LTL. We're trying to get their beak wet in the truckload space, and got a cool opportunity to join the organization. I've now been with Echo for about 16 years. Most of my time in the space has been spent on the carrier side of the organization. Initially led as VP of Carrier Sales, the Echo carrier sales team after the Command acquisition in 2015. Led the combined carrier organizations. Those were the first groups after that acquisition took place that we merged together. And then have spent the better half of the last 4 or 5 years kind of walking the tightrope between the carrier sales operations side of the business and also our general digital transformation strategy, kind of where the tech, the people, and the process all kind of come together. So thanks again for having me on today, and looking forward to this chat.
Awesome. And last, certainly least, just kidding. My first boss in freight, I should say, and one who I respect tremendously, Mr. Drew Herpich.
Thank you. No, appreciate being on today. But yeah, Drew Herpich, CCO over at NTG. I oversee our brokerage operation there. But yeah, started back in the day with Andrew at Coyote. And so when I came into the organization, probably one of the first, 20, 25 sales reps in that organization, I'll never forget the days, Andrew, of, at that time, you probably weren't even legal to be actually booking freight, but we'll keep that story for some time later. But yeah, no, worked my way up as a carrier sales rep, worked my way up to management. As Coyote grew, I was able to grow with it, and worked my way up to leading, obviously, their carrier sales division. And then after about 14 years there, made the move over to NTG, with what I saw with their growth and where they were going, and been over at NTG the last 4.5 years now.
Awesome. So we've got some quick introductions, and between these three companies, Arrive Logistics, Echo, NTG, I don't know what the number is. It's maybe $8 billion of transportation managed annually. Three of the largest, most reputable brokers in the industry. And our goal today is to kind of get into the world of carrier sales, carrier procurement, and how brokers of your size think about that, and how things are changing, and where the industry's going. So let's start with a softball, though. What makes a good carrier rep?
I'll jump in. I think that
I'm going to tackle first there.
I'd say I think there's a couple of things that make a good carrier rep. From my standpoint, you got to be hungry. This isn't a job where it just the business comes your way. You got to really figure out how you're going to carve your own niche, within the space. And the most successful carrier reps I've worked with in the past have been those that don't get lost in the chaos of a $1 billion plus marketplace that you might be managing internally, but really kind of find a niche and go after that aggressively. The other area that I would say I think is like really key to the success, certainly in this day of age, is somebody who understands the customer's point of view and how important service is in the value proposition that not just a carrier rep, but that a 3PL offers to the shippers that they work with. And so it's a combination of hunger and then a deep appreciation for customer service. I think that's critical and really kind of the tandem character attributes I see of those within my world that have had some success.
What are we adding to that, boys?
Yeah, it's well said. I think it's fair to compare a quality carrier rep to maybe a defensive back in the NFL, right? Like they say a defensive back needs to possess that like short-term memory as they get beat for that touchdown or the big play, from time to time. I think it's effectively the same for a carrier rep. Rejection, that's frequent. It's often in a carrier sales role. Really, from my experience, the great carrier sales reps, they don't allow rejection to impact their performance. Moving on to the next call, showing poise, confidence in that next call usually leads to success overall.
Yeah, I think, I'd probably double back on both of what they said there. I think that the biggest thing is just the motivation, right? You've got to be motivated. And, I think everybody, when I hear that you say that, probably thinks like money motivated. And don't get me wrong, that's part of it. But, when I think about, Echo, I think about Arrive, I think about NTG, our starting salary for a carrier rep is probably similar coming in, right? And I remember, guys, when I started in this industry, I started at $34,000 in Chicago. And I got to know real quickly that $34,000 is not going to pay my bills. Right. And so the one thing that I think about in this industry is having the go to get it. I think all three of us probably sell the same thing. You're not coming in to make the 40, 45, $50,000 salary. You're coming in to maybe be able to make six figures. And the one thing that I love about carrier sales more than anything is one of the few jobs, not only just in logistics, but overall, that first year you can make 100 grand. And everybody always looks at me like you're crazy. Every training class, though, there's one rep that will come out or a couple reps that will come out that will make 100 grand a year. And so for me, it's changing their lives, right? When I came through, right, it was different. But then I think about some of the people we've hired over the years, people that were, Uber drivers or bartenders or people that didn't have the opportunity, just the motivation that goes into that and the opportunity. That's something that I think makes it.
So what am I going to add here? I think communication skills, I don't know if it was said enough, but like the ability to effectively communicate and articulate what you're trying to do and what you need done is important. I think that honesty plays in this, and that could be more of a business practice than maybe an individual rep, but I think it does at the rep level matter in terms of if you're trying to build like long-term relationships with a carrier. If you're not honest with them and you're trying to cut corners to get them to take a load that's a work-in instead of an appointment, and you're not honest about it, like that makes for a bad carrier rep, I think. So from your perspective, when training reps, like what are the things that we're focusing on to develop those skills that you're looking for?
Yeah, I think I'll start with that one. What you just said there, Andrew, I think about one thing that happens all the time in a carrier rep's life. You think about the decisions you're making on a day-to-day basis. I remember when I used to come home from those days being either a carrier rep or carrier manager, and I would just look at my friends and be like, I don't want to make any more decisions today. Right. And because you're making thousands of decisions in that moment, whether it be how much you're paying the carrier, detention, where we're going to take that pallet. Hey, there's ants crawling all over the place. What do I do right now? Right. You're making decisions on the fly in the moment. And then you're making decisions on 20, 30, 40, 50 loads, right? You've got loads that are moving today. You got loads that are moving 2 days out. You got loads that are moving 3 days ago. And so for me, when you think about training that rep, how to make decisions quickly, how to understand where to go to make those decisions, so you can keep your day moving and obviously get to the other freight that you need to be.
I think
Yeah, I think it's really important to double down on not cutting corners, right? That was mentioned. That can help short term within one particular load, but what's going to happen long term? I think it's always going to come back to bite you potentially. And ultimately, from our perspective, from training, and I know Matt Pyatt, our CEO, incredibly bullish on mentorship overall. Mentorship is really how you set that foundation for carrier sales reps. Learn from the best and being able to execute overall.
I was just going to add, to the comment that Drew made. I think it's very easy for a new carrier rep who's not been in the industry for very long to get lost in the chaos of the brokerage space. I mean, there's so much freight. There's so many different types of niches you can pursue. And what we really try to encourage reps at Echo to focus on, and it's build a niche, build a market, build an equipment type, build a service that you can not make your own by any means, but really become an expert in, and then build on that over time. Don't try to accomplish the entire country on day one. Focus on an area where you can differentiate yourself. The other thing I would say to kind of build on that is the carrier sales role now is certainly one that has that kind of quick ramp for top performers like Drew mentioned. But I think what's really different from the world of a carrier rep now versus when I got into the business is you can make this a long-term career. The freight brokerages that we're all representing move enough freight that you don't gotta hustle off the open board every day to find that next spot load. You can build a repeatable book of business, and you do that by carving out a niche and becoming an expert in a specific area. And so I'd say as our new folks come into the organization, we do our best to help give them a focus or pair them with mentors like Blair mentioned who have done that themselves so they can learn through osmosis and figure out how do I not just achieve quick earnings, but build sustainable earnings in a long-term career.
Well, that's the thing too, Jay. You talk about that long-term career. Look at all four of us right now. I started as a carrier rep. Like you started as a carrier rep. Jay, you started as a carrier rep. Andrew, you started as a carrier rep at 16 years old. Right? We learned the industry through that, and I think it's important to understand what that truck driver goes through on a day-to-day basis to be able to do operations, customer sales, finance, whatever it might be in this industry overall.
I mean, that was an important rule that my father had at Coyote was you couldn't do any job unless you've done some level of the carrier rep job. And, he would bring in C-level people and make them go sit in training and go through carrier sales. And I agree with it. It's just like you said, I don't think that I could manage a brokerage as well if I didn't have 5-ish years of time spent getting to know these owner operators, their families, their business needs, the challenges that they were enduring day in and day out working with us. It just makes you a better leader to really have empathy for the quote unquote customer that you're trying to serve.
Yeah. I mean, Andrew, remember that trip me and you went on? This is, man, probably almost 15 years ago now, but I remember we had a dinner with about 10 different owner operators, all from different demographics, different areas of the country. And it was just so interesting to hear their stories, what they went through, how they went about building their business. And there's me and Andrew, a bunch of young 20-year-old punks trying to tell them how to broker and move their freight, right? And little did we know how to operate a fleet. Little did we know what it went into, costs and gas and insurance and everything like that. But learning that perspective, Andrew, I couldn't agree more with you.
Yeah, we called that the United Nations dinner because those were all my owner operators. One of them was like a 6'8" Dejan Zukancic from Serbia, Peter and Catherine Achukwu from Nigeria. There was a Jamaican, what's his name, Duke from Network Caller. I mean, it was a wild dinner that we had no business running. But I think the thing that these folks all appreciated from us, they did trust us. I mean, like their entire livelihood was built on the loads that you and I were sending them. And I mean, I was 17 or 18, you were 20, and we were sitting at desks moving loads around. And like, I think people sometimes don't realize the impact that we have as brokers on someone's actual life. And if you have a load that's, you tell a driver he's got an 8 a.m. delivery and someone made a mistake and it was actually meant to be 8 p.m. and that person's going to spend 12 hours sitting at that facility, you just screwed someone's day pretty badly and probably cost them at least several $100s, maybe in the thousands. And it's a click of a button. I mean, let's talk about that a little bit. Like, I think part of the importance of being a successful carrier rep is having empathy, but how do you go about making sure that your carrier reps are
doing the right thing, and that they're actually taking care of their carriers and their drivers, because I know all three of your companies want to have strong relationships with carriers and carriers that count on you. And at the end of the day, it's hard when you have hundreds of carrier reps to know exactly what each one of them is doing all the time. How do you make sure that people are being honest, doing the right thing? You know, all that we preach, how do we make sure people do it?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, I mean,
Falls quick.
Yeah, no, I'll say, like, I think one of the benefits from my perspective in this, like, more modern age of managing a carrier sales organization is the level of like data we have access to in terms of how people are doing their job. It makes that management of them much more objective than some of the subjective ways we used to have to kind of listen in on phone calls and read the tea leaves on if someone was doing the job effectively. And so at Echo, I think there's like this culture of embracing the data to help understand who's doing things by the book, who's maybe cutting corners and not managing their freight the right way. You can see it in the internal tracking data. You can see it in, accessorial discrepancies. If someone isn't, you know, dotting their I's and crossing their T's from a process standpoint. The other thing that we've started to do a bit more recently is like much more proactive surveying of our carriers, to get an unbiased perspective back, after their first shipments delivered, after their second shipments delivered, get a sense of how their experience with us was. And we use that as a way to not just give like the rep feedback, but figure out, are there business process changes we got to make a carrier who does their first load with Echo want to do their second load and their third load. I don't want to say I hate seeing one and done carriers in our data. And so anything we can do to keep those carriers in house, it's important to us. So I'd say we look at a lot of the internal metrics. We also try to get as much feedback from our carriers as possible to understand what their experience was like.
Yeah, that's well said. And what I would add on is, at Arrive, we have, a ton of continued ed that goes on within our L&D program overall. The business is always evolving. There's always process changes. I think it's important to really take a step back and ensure that everyone is following, the playbook, if you will, and just making sure that, if someone needs a little bit of training, that happens, happens in a structured manner overall. I really like the call out about the carrier surveys. I think that is really tangible feedback. You can obviously aggregate that data and then go direct to some of those individuals who may be interacting with those carriers and drivers overall, and really double click into that and figure out what the root cause of some of that feedback, whether that be positive or negative, is. So I think those are incredibly beneficial.
Yeah, I think the thing I would add is, you think about, what Jay said, what Blair said, and what I'll probably say, it all comes from that buy-sell model that we all came up in, right? And so, I came over to an organization 4 years ago that was historically cradle to grave. And I think it goes back to that, Andrew, of what you were kind of talking about a little bit. We didn't treat carriers always with respect. And I think what that boiled down to was, when you do that cradle to grave approach, the customer is always the most important, and the carrier is always second. And don't get me wrong, guys, cradle to grave can work in a lot of different situations. I actually had a friend on LinkedIn post a great thing the other day, produce customer, basically saying, hey, it works better for my organization, right? I think there's plenty of organizations out there that where cradle to grave can work, but I think where you're going with this is how you treat carriers, how do you make sure you get that respect from them? It comes back to me, Jay's right, data analytics, everything behind it, but it comes back to that relationship. It comes back to being that person, understanding at the end of the day what that carrier is going through, what they're looking for, how they're looking to grow their business, what they're looking to do, and having that feeling for them that you're actually going to go fight for them to get detention. You're actually going to fight for them to get that pallet off their truck. You're going to actually go fight for them to get that, trailer out of the tow yard, whatever it might be. Those are the things that I think will stick with people for a while. There's always going to be carriers that are going to be DFM. There's going to be carriers that are going to be one and done. There's going to be carriers that are going to follow the revenue spot. But I think building long-lasting relationships is one thing you can never really replicate.
So I want to talk about the cradle to grave concept, but I'm gonna come back to it. I want to stay on the carrier piece for a second around loyalty and carrier loyalty. And it's funny because I think back to maybe Molo's second year or third year as I was contemplating ways to get carriers to want to work with us more. And we were talking about a carrier loyalty, a driver loyalty program. And essentially, the concept was the more they hauled with us, the more rewards we could give them. And we were trying to figure out what kind of rewards we could get. But somebody who I ran this by, Paul Loeb, of all people, Blair, who you've worked for, and he was like, it's stupid. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, it'll never work. And I was like, why? He's like, because there's no such thing as carrier loyalty. Like the carriers go where the money goes. And I argued that. I didn't really agree. And I think, I've seen examples with owner ops where they were willing to be loyal. I mean, if I was going to pay them $500 less than the next guy, then yeah, they were going to go take that load. So I'm not talking about like exclusive loyalty, but what do you guys think about the idea of carrier loyalty? Is that still a thing, or is it only happen in pockets? And if it is, how do we establish it? Let's talk about that for a second.
I can almost hear Paul saying that in response to you. It definitely makes me chuckle. I think there's a blend in my opinion. I've experienced both, whether that be at a previous company or going through some discovery here at Arrive. But I personally think, broadly speaking, that there are great partners in our marketplace that are willing to operate with loyalty, as long as it's reciprocated, right? You don't necessarily need gamification to be able to see, carrier stickiness or drivers come back. I know, Jay, you mentioned like the one and done carriers overall. At the end of the day, everyone has financial obligations. So I think it's understandable that, some capacity might shift their strategy in evolving markets. And, they might go from, the spot market to the contract market, whatever that might be. But in my opinion, like loyalty can exist if both parties adhere to their overall agreements best as possible. I'll give you examples. Like on the dedicated side, when a carrier is awarded a lane for an agreed upon, period of time, there's that fundamental expectation that, both parties are going to stay committed to those terms. From our position, from my position, if a carrier, wants committed or dedicated business, as long as, they're willing to overall adhere to those, there might be net new lucrative contract opportunities for them. And we're going to go to them first to be able to have those discussions. I think conversely, you'll see some carriers repeatedly fall off some of those commitments. And, that might mean that we pause, some of those new RFP or award opportunities for those particular partners. So, again, when you get into this gamification, I think there's a place for it, but really it comes down to, that foundational aspect of, as long as you guys are working together within your carrier partners, I think that everyone can be successful, and you can see that loyalty really exist.
I hate to disagree with Paul because he is one of the obviously godfathers of this industry here, but I err on the side of you here, Andrew. I'm a bigger believer in carrier relationships where it goes. Because I think at the end of the day, everybody gets so excited on customer growth. And don't get me wrong, that's 50% of it, but the other 50% of these carriers that are hauling for you. And so as how I look at things is as the spot market gets more tight, with people getting into it and more brokers out there. I was with a customer the other day and they showed me this board real quickly, and it had 60 brokers on there that were bidding on the freight, right? Blake, you're on there, Jay, you're on there, we're all on there. And of those 60 brokers, $75 from the top to the bottom made a difference on that. So we're getting so sophisticated now on our pricing to customers, what we think that's out there. And so on that relationship piece, if I got that carrier in my back pocket that gives me $25, $50 more, that is a huge advantage, I think, into this market. Now, I think Paul's right. There's plenty of carriers out there that are going to only chase the revenue. They're chasing the dollar. They're going to move off your contract freight tomorrow. They're going to not commit. And for those type of carriers, you put them into a bucket. But man, there's a lot of carriers over here that I can actually use their trucks, go bid on behalf. When I look at our 5, 10, 15, 20 truck operations, they're looking at NTG as a source of revenue, right? They're looking to me as a customer. And so for that, I need to make sure that I'm taking care of my customer freight as well too with those relationships.
Yeah, and perhaps to defend Paul just slightly here, I I imagine that he's speaking more towards the think about it. If hey, if you do this, I'll give you a $75 reward or whatever that might be. I think that's where it's an interesting inflection point on how you actually reward your carriers overall. I totally agree. Relationships are critical when we think about like our core carrier network and how we kind of pursue that carrier stickiness. That's obviously pivotal in our business model. But I think just simply giving short term kind of gamification pieces back may not be a sustainable strategy for us. But I think that there are bits and pieces where you can take that and run with that long term overall.
Yeah, and I think I need to go on the record and state that I was not throwing shade at Paul there. And I think, yes, there was some lost in translation. I think his point was to thank you, Blair, for saying what you did, because I do think his point was more around like the game is not what's going to get a carrier to want to stick with you forever, because at the end of the day, they're going to go where the money goes. But he was not condemning carrier relationships by any means. So I'm on the record, the godfather of freight brokerage. I'm not throwing any shade at you.
None of us need a text from Paul, reaching out and asking some questions to us.
So around the concept of loyalty, I feel like when you think about the relationship between carriers and brokers historically, the connotation is very negative. And this is kind of true, and this is just generically speaking, but it's kind of true when you think about the relationship between brokers and shippers and how shippers view brokers. And it's certainly true of how carriers view brokers. In fact, when I was at the conference a few weeks ago for Reliance Partners, the Trucking Matters conference, and I was on a panel with all brokerage CEOs talking to a large audience of mostly carriers. When we got to the Q&A session, the only questions they wanted to ask were, what's your margin per load? How much money are you making off of me? And there's just this kind of mistrust. And I'm curious what you all think about that. Has any of that changed in the last 5-10 years? Has it improved at all? And additionally, like, what can we do as brokers to change it? Like, how do we get that relationship in general to a better place?
That's it's a great question. I'll start first, guys. And so, I think you talk about the broker to carrier piece. It was the same thing on the broker to customer piece, right? And I do believe COVID did change that for the better for the brokerage side of things, right? Brokerage for the customers for the longest time, guys, is a 4-letter word, right? And now when you actually look at their routing guides and you size them up, yeah, they're going to have the big boy assets in there, but they're going to have some sizable brokerages in their top 10 of their routing guide as well too. And so from that now, I think even the carriers kind of realize too, hey, the brokerages aren't just giving us spot freight. The brokerages aren't just giving us the one-off opportunities. The word that is dead, in my opinion, getting me a backhaul. I don't think carriers are looking at brokerages the same way now. And I think they're looking at that from more of a revenue stream. Now, I say this to our customers. I'll say this to our carriers. I'll say this to anybody in business. Everybody in business should be in there to make money, right? At the same time, though, too, what is outrageous? What is practical? How do you get to a point where you're sharing costs to a certain degree? Hey, I've been running a contract lane making $800 off you for 2 years. Yeah, those are some things that will leave a bad taste in a carrier's mouth and ask those kind of questions that you probably got on that panel. But for me now going forward, I think to your point, this is a much different ball game 5 years ago to where we are today with carriers and how we're looking at things.
Yeah, I think the stigma of being a broker and being a carrier up and kind of walking on eggshells when you're making an introduction to a new carrier is a totally different world than when we all entered the industry. And we do a lot more than just surveying at Echo, but I'm going to mention another survey question. Like, one of the questions we ask our carriers every year is, how do you perceive Echo as a 3PL versus a direct shipper? And I would say the based off of the value that we can add these carriers, they look at us now as equal or better than getting freight from a direct shipper. You know, we're not talking about the publicly traded carriers out there. We're talking about the 5-truck, 250 truck fleets. They look at Echo as a customer. They don't really think about us as just a broker that's going to help them move, one-off, freight. And I think if we asked carriers that question 15 years ago, the answers we would be getting are totally different than we get now. And so if you treat carriers with respect, I think they're going to look at you as more than just that, 5-letter word broker, so.
Yeah, I think respect is critical, and I've always found success in transparency and really like that relentless communication with our carrier partners. I think it's critical to set expectations and articulate what can transpire if those expectations are met or not. I think of brokerage as a sales arm for a carrier, and that can be, in reality, it can be incredibly powerful for that carrier who may not have the resources, time, technology to invest in accessing that freight. I know everyone's always worried about, hey, what did I leave on the table? But I know it was mentioned about everyone's got to make a margin here, and as long as that transparency exists, I think for both parties, set goals. That partnership can really lead to financial success and growth for both the broker and the carrier overall.
Yeah. I think something you say too, Blair, obviously I don't think any carrier wants to get ripped off from their broker. Their broker needs to be financially stable as well too. They want to get paid. I mean, we saw a very large broker that we talked about earlier on this conversation that went out and didn't pay some bills, right? That's the last thing a carrier is going to want to deal with at the end of the day. And so I think for us being financially responsible to our carriers, how that relationship look is just as important as well too to the carrier.
Is there some element of technology that's changing the game for carriers with respect to how they engage with brokers? And part of this for me is thinking about the concept of Convoy for brokers or Flexport, whatever it is, and the load boards that are now not just a DAT board, but a place where a carrier can log into one of your platforms or another company's platform and just take a load, book it now, whatever you want to call it. How do you feel like that's kind of changing the game in terms of the carrier broker relationship and just in terms of how the carriers operate?
I would say from my point of view, like the carrier universe is so diverse, and not even just within like the different fleet sizes, but the way those companies, even within the same fleet size groupings, want to operate. And so I think that from my point of view, technology is definitely changing the way many carriers interact with Echo, but it's not creating a uniform process that all carriers, have to fall into. The way we kind of describe it here is like we've got everything ranging from a person, which is, call it the least tech driven solution, through direct API connectivity that we've got with the large carriers, that we work with. And so in between those two ends of the spectrum are, mobile apps, our own Echo Drive, DFM. We work with a couple third parties that some portion of our freight can be exposed to. And so we try to meet the carrier where they want to be met individually. If a carrier wants to work through a rep, they can still work through a rep. But for those that are becoming a little bit more tech savvy, a little bit more tech focused, trying to run an efficient operation within their four walls, we want to offer a number of different technology solutions to kind of help them out. We want to meet them where they want to be met in their own technology, journey. And I guess what I've seen as that technology has come into play and kind of hits on some of the earlier conversations is I think the tech has been a catalyst in some ways for Echo in building stickier relationships with some of the partners within our network. You, as a carrier rep, you can only make so many phone calls a day.
can only send so many emails, have so many WhatsApp conversations. You build a relationship, and as part of that, you start to offer them access to freight through a technology medium. It lets you go from booking 50 loads a month with a carrier to 150 loads with a carrier, pretty quickly. And so I think the tech has in many ways made the relationships even stickier because they act as an extension of that representative that they've historically worked with.
Yeah. I honestly think, one of the interesting inflection points was really the ELD mandate. I think that was a primary driver in technology adoption and acceptance overall. Whether or not you're talking about, you've got your web portals, you've got your apps, you've got everything that goes on there. I think like that was maybe the point where it was, okay, now there's some let's call it forced technology that's implemented here. Now, who's the resistance, if you will, and how can we really like pull some capacity along internally? How can we have some acceptance to utilize technology? And I think at Arrive and similar statements that you made, Jay, is we really reference like our co-pilot model. We're not sitting here and trying to force our capacity to use one specific technology tool. We'd like to hear how they want to operate, and then we can really accommodate them and help them be efficient and effective along the way. And we've received a ton of positive sentiment to that, perhaps even in a carrier survey that you love so much, Jay. So we've really seen some positive reactions to that co-pilot strategy overall.
Yeah, no, I think I'm not going to echo too much more what Blair and Jay said, and we try to do the same thing of getting carriers to our Beyond Carrier platform here at NTG. I'll even take it like a different approach, guys. I don't even think it's so much carrier. It's the world we live in now today. Nobody wants to talk. Nobody wants to communicate. Everybody wants to go through this technology. Those social connections are harder and harder to get to. And so I think Jay made a great point. How does a carrier want to work with us, right? I always go back to this, carrier thing. I've been hearing this for the 18 years I've been in the industry. Drivers are getting older. The driver's age has been 55 years old for the last 18 years, the average age, right? It's not moving one way or the other, right? I do believe the younger drivers that are coming in to our workforce are much more tech savvy and will continue to go that way. I think the older school drivers, worked with 3, 4, 5 brokers, where these new drivers, some of these new carriers I've talked to, they're working with 30, 40, 50 brokers, right? And the reason they're able to do that is from a technology perspective. They weren't able to do that before. Now they can get, off their drive. They're looking at, 4 or 5 apps on really quickly, different screens, different portals, being able to compare what prices and points like that. And so I think technology is going to help them get freight quicker. I think technology is going to help them be more profitable if they use it the right way. At the same time, though, too, I still believe at the end of the day, to get to that dedicated purpose or to be able to haul more significant type of volume, you've got to build a relationship with that carrier as well, too.
How do we deal with tracking though? Because I haven't been a broker in 15 months, but when I was a year and a half ago, like it was still hard to get carriers to get on board with the tracking piece of the technology, whether it's especially Forekites and MacroPoint, especially with the consistency. It's one thing to get them to be tracked, but to get that consistency to the numbers that our shippers are requiring of us was always a challenge. And I believe it maybe still is. Like what's driving that?
I don't know. Blair, Jay, let me know if you feel differently. I think the carrier community has finally accepted the fact that everybody's going to track you in some form of way, right? I think the acceptance to track those loads is at a very, very high level, right? 70, 80, 90% for most brokerages. I think it goes back to what you just said there, Andrew, the consistency, right? The in and outs of Wi-Fi, the in and outs of you keeping the app open, whatever it might be. That's where I think we struggle through some of this. And then I think people struggle with, does the technology work or not? That's where I think we're at in the industry now. I do think the carriers have got, past the whole big brother thing. I think they understand why most people are wanting to look at this from more of a transparency standpoint. But that's where I think we are today. And Blair, Jay, I don't know if you feel differently.
I agree with you. I think there's been a big shift, maybe Andrew, in your 15 months out of the game, where the behavior's changed a bit. I think that the softer market has probably given 3PLs a little bit more of a leg to stand on. And At the same time, the customer's, kind of definition in many ways, the shipper being the customer, used to talk about service purely through the lens of like on-time pick and delivery. Now they're judging 3PLs on on-time pick and delivery, tender acceptance, electronic tracking performance, and a lot of that, I think, has trickled down to the carriers because they understand the metrics we're being held accountable to. But I'd say the resistance that was very prevalent from, call it 16 to 2021, has started to die down a bit. I'd also say one of the big shifts for us was, and the ELD, I think the ELD mandate helped with this. ELD devices are our preferred method of electronic tracking, where we started pushing carriers more for that connection type versus the mobile, is probably one of the process changes that really drove our own internal success metrics up. We've got a team actually, focused on that activity specifically, and I think it takes a lot of the unknowns off the table when you're relying purely on that mobile tracking experience. So I think there's been some market tailwinds that have helped out, and then also just some process changes
And
too.
let me ask, is that something that was an echo strategic push, or you were hearing from carriers that they preferred that?
I would say we were hearing from our carrier reps that the easiest way for them to achieve their success metrics in that category were through ELD and TMS integrations. And I think what we realized was that not the sell, but like the hand holding to get a carrier set up for an ELD, connection. It's not like rocket science, but it takes time, it takes focus. It can be distracting to get that work done when you're trying to book freight or deal with exceptions. And so I think as we recognize that opportunity and the success our own people were experiencing, we worked to organize a support structure around that to help the reps out, but also meet the needs of our customers that were starting to make decisions on who they were going to award freight to based off of a Forkites compliance score, a Project 44 compliance score. There was a number of factors, but honestly, I think the carrier reps raising their hands and saying, I can be at 90% success if I just get the tractor numbers from our carriers versus getting the driver's cell phone, asking them to download the app, asking them not to block their location. It just took a lot of the friction off of the table. And so our carrier reps in some ways led us to that discovery, I would say.
Yeah, and Jay, I think you're really drilling into consistency there, and same, from Arrive's perspective as well. ELD has really been able for us to show, within those scorecards some auto track consistency and compliance within those measures overall. I think for us, it's really about table stakes and integration capabilities and acceptance towards real time tracking visibility. Is what does that mean for our capacity? That's access to freight, potentially lucrative enterprise level freight that otherwise, they just quite frankly wouldn't have access to. So I don't see as much, detractors, if you will. And again, I know we've touched on this a couple times, but I think, the ELD mandate was that kind of critical point for us to remove some of that capacity that wasn't willing to participate with some of that big brother type concept that we talked about earlier. But overall, I think there's a willingness to participate, and it does come down to, it's not necessarily complex, but it is tedious to be able to ensure that there is that consistent visibility to auto tracking and ensuring that we're meeting the the requirements of our customers and shippers overall.
So in 2026, which sadly I don't think I'm going to commit to 2025 yet, but in 2026, when the market is humming and it is way harder to get a truck on your loads, are we going to toss all these expectations and requirements around things like tracking? Because it's just, if you want a load, if you want a truck, you got to take the truck that's available. Do we think we get back to that?
I don't think we go backwards on this. I think it's an understandable thing. I think I think Jay said it as well too. The one thing that we're echoing to our carriers as well too. This is how we win more freight from our customers. This is how we can be more competitive out there. So to your question there, Andrew, no, I don't see us going backwards on this. I think this is like Blair said, this is table stakes going forward. This is something that brokerages and customers are going to expect from carriers. I don't see us going backwards on this technology.
That's a great point. I've never thought about selling to a carrier through the lens of this is how I get you more business. This is how shippers give me more loads, getting them to have some empathy for the position you're in. It's like, listen, I trust you. I don't need to see where your truck is every 5 minutes. And I'm pretty sure the shipper doesn't even look themselves, but this is the requirement. And if I don't do this, then I'm not getting the load. And if I don't get the load, you don't get the load, at least from me. And you're gonna have to go find it somewhere else.
Yeah. I think that's the sell internally that resonates with the carriers. That's how our people generally get the compliance we need them to get. It's kind of positioning it the way that you just did. And I think I agree with what Drew said. And I think also these carriers, they don't want 15 phone calls, per 600 miles to get updates along the way. Those updates are needed now. And like, however the 3PL gets them, I don't know if the shippers are ultimately going to care in a tight market, but the carriers are going to care because they're not going to want a driver getting bombarded or a dispatcher getting bombarded asking for updates. And so I think we've reached that like tipping point with electronic tracking where it's just part of the way 3PLs and carriers now operate.
Well, let's remember one thing too. This is where I pose this, and I've had a lot of discussions with customers about this. And this is the one thing I think people really didn't look under the hood on this. Technology is great on this tracking. Right now, we've gotten to this point at table stakes. Guess what hasn't changed though? Pickup percentage on time and delivery percentage on time. Those remain the same for the most part, right? When I look back the last 18 years in this industry, those have remained the same. Those standards have remained the same. The expectations from customers generally have remained the same. And so you put a lot of work into this. You put a lot of, time, resources, things behind that. When I look at the numbers, we're talking 0.5, maybe 1% of what you're seeing in the difference in pickup and delivery. Now, to your point, it gives you that warm and fuzzy feeling, right? It's the same thing that we feel like when we order a package and you see it's tracking on this truck down the road. You don't know where it is, right? And, the one thing that I've always argued with old school guys, right? Andrew Silver, I go back to the days of like Sean Storr, right? The big difference is, everybody always wanted to talk to the driver. Would you ever think the driver was lying to you about where he's at? And so the thing with technology, though, you get that warm and fuzzy feeling, you get that breadcrumb, you understand where that red dot is on the map. And those are things today and age that I think we Jones for. We Jones for the knowing, we Jones for the where things are, how things are right away, information at the fingertips. That's where I think we are today with really digital tracking too.
The only, I agree with you in general, Andrew. I think the only thing I would say, and I'm going to be somewhat discreet in my commentary here, is I think that the initial reason we all got connected with we were pushing on this requirement was the customer saying to us, you need to push us the data every 15 minutes. Yep. What that unlocked from my point of view, though, is the ability for 3PLs to collect data throughout the life cycle of a shipment. 100%. And we're now all in a position to do something with that data to be more proactive in addressing certain exceptions that are popping up. And so I'd say like we've actually on our side been able to, in some ways, like allow carrier reps to be a little bit less hands-on with their freight if that electronic tracking gets set up appropriately, because we've built out like notifications and different alerts to let someone know that there's a problem, as opposed to having to babysit every one of your loads, go into the load and kind of just mentally check, is the driver in the right location versus the delivery. If you do something with that data, I think you can actually really create some efficiencies in your operations and also be more proactive in trying to improve that on-time percentage. If you're removing a truck because they're not making their way to the pickup on time or getting in front of a missed delivery 24 hours in advance because you can see the driver's trending in the wrong direction. And so I agree in general, the service performance hasn't materially changed as an industry, but I do think there's opportunity for organizations like ours to do something with that data and deliver our customers a better surprise-free kind of experience is, I guess, how I would.
I couldn't agree more with you too, Jay. When you get to the granular part of it, you're 100% right, right? Individual customers, individual carriers, things like that. My thing was just more overall industry-wise. We just haven't moved a ton of, delivery.
Totally.
I'm curious, Jay kind of alluded to how a carrier rep's role, I don't want to say his role has changed, but his focus can shift a little bit as a result of the technology improvement. And I'm going to use that to segue us into AI. Let's talk about where things stand today with respect to AI, and let's start in the carrier rep function or in the carrier procurement process. What are you guys seeing? What are you dabbling with in your own businesses? I've got some thoughts, but I want to hear from you what you're seeing.
Who wants to spill the beans on their secrets real quickly?
I think you're kicking us off. I think you're kicking us off here.
You open your mouth, Herpich.
Hey, you guys know I'll share. So obviously this is at the forefront of what we're looking at, and I think let's call it the top 20, 30 brokerages are really looking at how this looks. I was at a conference the other day, and I thought one of the guys said it best. Everybody wants to use AI, but you have to ask the question of why. Because if you are using it, you better get the use out of it. If not, you're just spending a lot more money and cost going into something that could probably produce the same thing for. But we're looking at different models, learning methods, some of the things that we think about, doing spot quoting and getting freight to the customers and being able to do that systematically from an AI approach. That's something that I think that will continue to go. And then to your point there, Andrew, instead of having to hunt for freighter and get freighter, things like that, the carrier rep role turns into a little bit more of a consultative role, right? How they should be looking at their triangles, their quadrilaterals, how they're looking at to get their revenue, what areas of the country they should be coming in and out of, and what time of the year. Getting more into those specifics than just finding you a load for the most amount of money possible. That I think will be generated by a lot of the AI, the data, and the things that we're probably all pushing forward on our end, right?
Yeah, and what I'll add on is, at Arrive, we interact with our carriers through, really a flywheel of options, and that's whether that be data science driven algorithms, notifying our capacity of transactional shipments that they might be interested in. You've got, matching models, also initiating email marketing or notification prompts, and and then in addition to that, you're trying to provide the web portals. For us at Arrive, we've got a product called Now Carrier that really affords a dispatcher or planner the opportunity to interact with Arrive shipments on their time. They can initiate those bids. You have the book it now concept, or browse through kind of those consistent or dedicated opportunities that they might want to have further conversations about ultimately, dedicating that or what we call committed capacity overall. So I think for us, in reality, carriers within the Arrive network, they're not necessarily restricted to operating during those traditional business hours. And I think that that's important as we've kind of evolved through time here. Instead of a shipment from think of a time where a shipper suddenly cancels an 8 p.m. Shipment on a Friday. We've obviously got staffing 24/7, but a user can also log on, select a shipment, generate revenue, and save a driver's hours of service all through a click of a button. I think one other procurement method that I know we all have familiarity with, but is the dedicated kind of routing guide model. I think that's where mostly for Arrive within our preferred cohort, we heavily participate in, and it's almost like a shipper-like perspective. We're awarding, these fleets enterprise and mid-market lanes, really based upon cost basis that, again, we're leveraging data science algorithms on. We're looking at historical service, acceptance, adherence, and other metrics. And we've seen this create, going back to that conversation before about carrier loyalty, really stickiness and further engagement with our fleets. It also supports efficiencies when we talk about cost to serve, right? I'm sure you guys have similar experiences within the technology realm, but I think it's an interesting conversation overall.
So those are two cagey responses from me and Blake. What are we going to spill the beans on here, Jay?
I mean, I'll say this. I still think that, like, I think the industry is still in the top of the first inning, kind of trying to figure out the AI use cases. And, and in some ways, I think that there's this like blend, like, I don't know, blend's the wrong way to describe it. A lot of times the word AI is used when we're just talking about like, rule driven processes within a, TMS that kind of suggests certain actions get taken. That's not necessarily, AI. And so what I'd say, just being, transparent, is we're still figuring it out at Echo. I think what we know is that there's a tremendous amount of communication with carriers, with customers, that happens in email. Email is the universal technology in our industry. The mobile app is never going to displace the thousands of emails that all of our people get on a weekly basis. And I don't think there's an application for AI to replace all of those emails by any means. But I think there's certain workflows, certain processes our people are managing on a daily basis that feel ripe for disruption, or in the AI world. And so I don't know, that's could be replying to emails that a customer sends in asking for a tracking update on a load. You could use NLP to understand what that customer's asking for. You could have that AI go retrieve the most recent update from your system, automate the response, back to that customer. The same thing could happen with dozens of carrier use cases. And so I'd say we're right now trying to really figure out where true AI could be deployed within our business to build on top of the data science driven initiatives and kind of machine learning initiatives that are already in place. I think we're still figuring out where AI makes the most sense, because what I believe strongly for years to come is that, like, the relationship between our carriers and our brokers, between our shippers and the account teams that manage them, that's going to continue to be paramount in a lot of the decisions that are made. And so I think we're trying to figure out, where does AI take work off of people's plates to spend their time on stickier, more customer service centric activities, or, what can we chip off around the edges to help our carriers or customers out in more of a real-time manner. So transparently, we're still figuring it out at Echo, but we see some really exciting use cases, both in terms of how we bring some of that decision-making power into our TMS, but I think specifically around the inbox, there's a lot to be done in that general communication.
It's an interesting call, Jay, and I want to touch on it for a second. You mentioned email is kind of the preferred methodology, even as we've advanced with product technology, AI overall. Why do you, and we see similar things at Arrive, where our customer, our capacity overall tends to revert back to email as kind of the norm. Why do you think that is?
I think it's just so much of your job, even outside of carrier and broker communication, happens within email. I think about, like, when we were all carrier reps, I didn't email a customer sales rep at Echo asking for a question about a shipment or an opportunity. I picked up the phone and I walked over to their desk. Echo's got 22 locations. We've got a centralized carrier group that's in 9 different offices. We can't have those face-to-face discussions. So I think the fact that so much internal communication happens in email, not just for us, but even for the carriers that we support, they're emailing their other coworkers, throughout the day. And so it's a captive medium where when you think about any employee in logistics having 3 monitors up, I can almost guarantee email takes up the real estate on at least one of those monitors. And so it's so ingrained in a lot of what we do. So I think that's one part of it. I think that there's still, like we talked about earlier, this long tail of this diverse carrier, universe that many of them still want to interact over email as their preferred communication method, despite the explosive DFM adoption we've probably all seen. Email still is a big part of how we all do our jobs. And I think there's a number of different factors, but it's where you do outside of your TMS, it's probably where the most work any of our people do actually takes place.
Yeah. Well, it's also looking at all those platforms. Now, we say email. It's email. It's GChat. It's Telegram. It's WhatsApp. Everything that's out there. Where we came up in the face-to-face phone, right? I mean, guys, when I started back in 2007, I mean, Andrew, you remember we had a 16-page carrier packet, and you had to individually get that thing over there. Right, you're clicking clicking a button. Right? Yeah, when I walk by some of these desks, when I first, Skype was the big thing. Now they've got 4 different channels up. They've got their WhatsApp on their portal. They're talking to their carriers on Facebook. I mean, there's just so many different ways that we're connecting with these carriers. I think that's where you can see some of the impact from AI, collecting more of this data information, things like that where we can have a bigger impact long term too.
Is there a business there? Is there an aggregator? Is there a communication aggregator that you can integrate all those platforms, WhatsApp, email, Facebook, whatever you want to add, and it just puts it on one little screen in front of you? Is that an idea, or does that already exist somewhere, or am I just not making sense?
I got a couple of vendors in my inbox probably right now that I can go through to look. I've seen a couple of these.
When I was a carrier rep, this company's long out of business, but there was a company that used to do what you're called. I think they were called Meebo, and I could get AOL, Gmail. I'm dating myself with AOL as a communication, but everything in one kind of interface. I don't know if that's still around though. Maybe it's your next idea.
Not.
Yeah, I think you just created a business idea right here.
Let's
run with it.
Yeah.
But I will say, Blair, I'm thinking about this while we're talking. I think that email lets you connect with a lot of people at once. And I'm not suggesting spam email, but you think about a carrier sharing their capacity. You think about a broker sharing available loads with the companies that maybe haven't adopted their digital technology. It lets you expand your reach tremendously versus the phone calls that we were all, used to coming up in the space. And so, I don't think you can be successful if that's all you rely on, but I think it is the universal technology across all stakeholder groups in our space.
Yeah. The one other thing that you touched on there is, you mentioned sharing capacity overall. And, when we all started, it's a truck list, right? That truck list gets sent over in a vast array of different formats overall. And then traditionally, what do you do with that? Well, you got to enter that capacity, and then you got to figure out how to match that capacity. And then, maybe you're emailing back and you're sharing, options overall. So I think, again, without, giving up too much here, I think, we all are exploring opportunities to be able to ingest that capacity and respond to that efficiently. And again, let's point out, that's going to help all parties. That's going to help with efficiency. That's going to help with speed, and that's going to help with revenue opportunities for everyone overall.
So there's one part of AI that we didn't quite talk about. Maybe it was my fault for not directing the question the right way, but I was thinking about these AI agents that I've seen speaking to carriers. And I don't know if any of you have tested or seen the recordings of this, but essentially to phrase it for the audience, essentially it's an AI agent, as they're called, who answers an inbound call from a carrier, and the carrier is interested in a load, and they ask for the details on the load. The AI bot agent thing gives the details and goes as far as to negotiate the load, but doesn't execute the sale. And when it's time to execute the sale, they say, I'm going to pass it now to basically a human to confirm the full movement. Now, this is the first kind of iteration of this AI agent, and I'm curious, is this something you think can have a meaningful role in carrier procurement and sales moving forward?
The carrier side is one side of it. Customer sales, I'll say right away, no, I don't. Right. I think that's a different, if you're going to be
What are
giving,
you answering a question I didn't ask? I didn't ask about customer sales.
Well, I went into the customer sales. I wanted to tell you my one opinion of it. All right. We're not going to have this on customer sales, in my opinion. Right. Carrier sales, though, I think there is an opportunity to see this. Now, I'll say this, though. Everybody focuses so much on the booking process. To me, like that is like the simplest process, right? Of it, right? Where it actually comes in for a carrier before you add value is the things in transit, the problems that happen. Like I said, there's one too many pallets on the truck. That's the tough part. The actual selling of the load. You think about the digital boards we have, the ease of selling a freight quickly. That to me is something where if you're going to pay for an AI, you're still going to have those carrier reps somewhere, or whether you call them carrier reps, whether you call them operations reps, where you call them back office support, whatever you want to call it, somebody's going to still have to step into a lot of those steps. And so I think that solves one of it. But the one thing that I'm seeing the gaps right now, to Andrew, is just what you said there. Hey, let me go through this whole process with you, and then get a rep on with you. And then that rep's like, hey, what would you sell that load for? Was it $1,600 to that AI rep? There's a lot of things that I think I need to be sure up before we go into that direction.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to hit on, because from discussing this with some of the carrier floor overall, I think that I think that carrier reps are always going to want to resell and renegotiate no matter what, right? So how else can we think about this problem? Maybe it's a qualification. It's qualifying the carrier overall, and then that could have a use case for it. When we get back to what is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Is it pure efficiency play? Is it pure automation play? Or what really are you trying to take with this AI and solve for it? We've all sat here and preached, throughout this session, relationships. And I still don't think that you can remove that and replace that with an AI agent overall. But some of the things that are intriguing are qualifying the carrier, and then also, perhaps logging the bids that potentially would come through there. Because we all know, sometimes, reps are really busy with their day to day, whether or not they're going to necessarily take the time to log that offer. They could get distracted with other events that transpire. So that could be an interesting use case for some of this, AI that's coming into play. I think it's got some room for growth overall, though.
I agree with that. I think we're still kind of in the early stages of that technology really coming to market. I do think that there's a very high likelihood that we see significant advances in the next 12, 18, 24 months. These LLMs and large language models, these are advancing so rapidly that I think that it's very likely there will be some use cases in the brokerage space to handle, I think, more customer service focused inbound inquiries. Maybe the small percentage of call-ins we get from non-relationship carriers, maybe those can be vetted through an AI agent. But from what I've seen, today, I don't think the technology is really ready for the main stage. That could change very quickly. I'm just commenting on what I've seen so far. I think there's some, nuances to that carrier broker connection that aren't being captured today. And, I've shared my feedback with some of the companies in this space. I think they're too focused on just the price and the one load. And so much of like the broker carrier relationship is built through those negotiation opportunities where you start to also track freight or offer them long-term opportunities outside of just that one load focused conversation. And I think that there's risks in trying to make each phone call about one specific activity, not just from a relationship standpoint, but maximizing the use of the carrier's time. If you're, not trying to sell, get into some of the other conversations, I think you're going to end up making an outbound phone call back to them in 30 minutes. And so I think this technology has a long way to go before it really could be taken seriously within our space.
Yeah, I think it's so hard because the thing I've heard over and over again is just the rate at which this technology is going to advance is like exponential. And it's just crazy how fast it's going to grow once it starts. Now that it's started, and I've seen the early models and I wasn't that impressed, but if I'm taking into account the growth factor, I have to assume it gets wildly better. But the point you just made was really interesting to me because I used to, and it's been so long since I was selling loads to carriers, but I used to tell other reps, like the way I thought about it was the more time I was on the phone with the carrier, the less time they could be talking to a competitor. And that first phone call I had with a carrier, I wanted to talk to them for an hour. I wanted to learn every single thing there was to learn about their business, their family, their personal life, their needs, whatever it was, whatever they cared about, I was going to care about. And, at the same time, Blair, you talked earlier about setting expectations. For me, that's what that first phone call was about. It was about learning as much as I can about them. And in conjunction with that, setting the expectations of what the relationship will look like. From my side, I was making commitments on how I would treat them. I would be honest, that I would give them my cell phone number and answer whenever they needed to and do my best to solve their problems. And in return, I expected they'd be honest with me. They would try to be on time as often as possible, and they'd be reasonable when shit hits the fan, when there are issues, because to me, those are the things that are kind of most important. And when I think about the bot or AI agent I heard take an inbound call, it certainly wasn't thinking about a long-term strategic relationship. And maybe that's just not what its job is, and it never will be. Or maybe it listens to enough of those phone calls I just described, and it learns how to do it itself. And so I'm so curious about this because there's part of me that's the naysayer that kind of thinks about this like the next blockchain fad. And I know it's way bigger than and will be more useful than blockchain ever was in our industry. But you see these hype trains that come for whatever's the newest, cutest thing. And so part of me, the naysayer, thinks that, and the other part's like, listen, it's happening. I mean, this is where all of the attention in the world is focused right now. Why would we be any exception? So I don't know. I'm so curious because if it does advance at the rate that, people describe it being able to, there's a world where it changes kind of carrier procurement in a lot of ways. And that's where I start to get really curious about how organizations change. I mean, you're certainly going to be doing more with less is the simplest way to think about it. And it's not to say you need to go fire 50% of the carrier reps, but you certainly don't need to hire more as you continue to grow. And then it's like, can carrier reps still make as much money? The concept will be you'll do more with less. So, the percentage may go down, but you're going to be booking 100 loads instead of 50. So you can make more in aggregate. But I'm just curious if you guys have any additional thoughts to what I'm sharing right now. I'd love to hear them.
Well, I got one that we didn't talk about it because we looked at this really from the lens of carrier procurement, getting the freight to the carriers, the broker efficiency, our costs, everything that goes into that. The one thing that I don't think we think about enough, right, is when you think about the carrier itself. You're driving a truck 400, 500, 600 miles a day, and guess who you're doing that truck with? Yourself. Sometimes you want to talk to somebody. I can't tell you how many times, the phone calls that would come in that we analyze were just people wanting to talk to somebody. wanting to tell them about their day, wanting to tell them about the struggles that the shipper, the consignee, whatever it might be. I do believe in the truck driving world, there is something from a carrier that a lot of these owner operators and something like that want to have that human connection at some point in the day. You put yourself in their shoes. You got up at 7 a.m., drove that 500 miles. You get to this consignee, somebody treats you like shit there, doesn't give you a bathroom, tells you to go away, go wait in line. You sit by yourself in the cab for 2 hours. You just want to talk to somebody. You want to vent to somebody. You want to talk to somebody about your day. I do believe from the carrier world that there is something there behind that as well, too.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. What do you guys, I know we're talking about procurement overall and covering loads, finding capacity and using these AI agents for that function. What about support services, driver services, whatever you call it? Think about some of those tasks. Do you guys leverage any sort of AI, today within think about like, hey, I'm calling in for a pickup number, right? Do you guys utilize any of that today?
Not that I would describe as AI. I think more of like
NLP.
Smart workflows, to kind of streamline the ability to get information and give it back to a driver quickly. But that to me is where I think many companies in our space, their AI journey should start. It's in that customer service realm where somebody just needs a quick piece of information that doesn't necessarily require any real strategic thinking or solution design. What's the pickup number? What are the hours of operation? That type of stuff that we get at Echo, thousands of phone calls a day from drivers like looking for those bits of information or to give a routine update. I think that's the more reasonable place to try to start to play with this technology. Today, that again, to Andrew's point, I think it would be naive to think that this technology doesn't advance rapidly and put us all in a position where we have to think long term about what that means for our people. But customer service is where I would, encourage that focus to be out the gates.
Yeah. I think where you'll see it too, Andrew, is the front of the load and the back of the load. I think the in-between load will be a lot tougher to do the AI portion. I think the front of the load, though, getting information, getting quick, picking numbers, things like that. Then I think about the back end of like, how do you get actually paid? You think about the invoicing process of that, going through, does my load have a BOL? Does it have the POD? Does it have the, those are things I think on the back end and front end. I think the middle part, that's where I think Jay's correct. There needs to be a lot more that goes into this for us to be ready on that.
All right. Well, we've done our dance on AI, so we can move off of that. I think one more large topic I want to spend a little bit of time on before we wrap today is this freaking market and what is seeming like a really tough 2 years now that you all have endured, and carriers have endured. What are we seeing? Is there any hope in the near term? Let's talk about that a little bit, what you all are seeing and what you're hearing out there.
I'll start. And the answer is yes. I think the hope started a couple of weeks ago, and I think where you saw it kind of catapult, I think for the industry was probably DOT week, right? And that started things going. Then you go into Memorial Day, and then you go into end of month. I think that was a good catalyst. I think all of us saw our cost per mile from that standpoint start to tick up. I think tender rejections have been at a historical low for years, and you're starting to see that tick up a little bit. I think where we're going to start to see the real tick up here is that everybody, from the 19,000 brokers that are out there, you saw like we call it paper rates, and I think a lot of people put paper rates into their routing guides, into their contracts. I think a lot of shippers were told from the top, we need to save money, right? You think about a large company. The quickest way to save money, or the quickest way you're going to go is into that transportation field. And so they told all those guys, save even more, right? And so I think, what I've seen over time is a big shift in the shipper world where procurement is getting a little bit more strength than operations used to. And what I see by that is rates are more important just on the paper. Operations figured out on the back end of what you need to do. I think we're going to see a big catapult on that going forward. But it comes down to, guys, supply and demand. Obviously, the supply has been coming out of the market at an alarming rate over the last 6 months. I think demand is kind of fluttered a little bit. We haven't seen what we want. I think we do have some powerful things going forward, from imports and some of the macroeconomic indicators. I think having an election year always gives you a little bit of a, kind of a slow run into that until you really know who's going to win one way or the other. And then I think we have some big things on the horizon that can really change things. We mentioned on this call a couple times ELDs. If this speed limit enforcement happens, that's going to be a huge shakeup in our industry. I think, like ELDs again, and I don't think enough people are talking about that. And so, for me, I do see the run up starting now, but this isn't quick ever. And I think everybody wants, in our world, to say, hey, it's back. It's never like that in the freight world, guys, right? And what I think you'll see is in 6 months from now, we'll wake up a lot happier. In 12 months from now, on the brokerage side of things, we'll be thrilled with where that's at.
Am I the only one who's not seen this speed limit enforcement thing? I'm gonna show my ignorance or lack of knowledge here, but what are you talking about?
So the federal mandate that they're thinking about doing this across the board is lowering the speed limit, right? So just like you think about the ELDs of shortening the miles so you can be able to travel, now 1,000-mile run, if you're not able to go, 63 miles per hour instead of 68 miles per hour, there'll be a huge effect
For
on that.
trucks or for all of us?
For truck.
Okay.
And I think the interesting thing there is how do you actually execute that, right? Is that for just new trucks? Or when we think back to, again, like we're bringing up ELD again, do you go and have to retrofit for within your outdated or old equipment to be able to have that enforcement going on? That should be an interesting play as we move forward here. I think like I'll give a shameless plug. Arrive sends out a carrier market outlook update, and
Shout out David Spencer.
Shout out David Spencer, the best. And I think for us, his position, our position overall, the remainder of 2024, increased volatility compared to the majority of Q1. You mentioned it, like capacity is continuing to exit the marketplace. It's causing some slight strain within the supply chain. I think it's generating some upward rate movement overall. I think the next couple of months are really going to be key indicators for us on what happens here moving forward. You mentioned revocations of authority and new carriers entering the market. Those are quality indicators in really determining the attractiveness of the marketplace. What is it like? The last 17 of the last 19 months, I think we've seen that reduction in or revocations in authority overall. So clearly something is transpiring, and perhaps that means a turn is coming here shortly.
I think I would say from my perspective, at least, the capacity data is sends mixed signals from my point of view, because you see this information of net revocations going down every month, but you look at the total number of tractors operating in the same breath, and it's still well above pre-pandemic conditions.
Is that owners moving to companies that they just don't want to manage their own business anymore? Is that what I'm hearing?
I think owner ops are leaving the industry, and they're either going to not leaving the industry. They're shutting down their operation, and they're either going to lease on to a larger organization, maybe in some situations selling their equipment, other trucking companies purchasing it, filling it with another driver. But we've seen the growth slow down of fleets in the market, but you haven't seen that same decline really begin yet that you saw go up from 2020 to 2022. I do think might be the calm before the storm. Just being honest, I think that the rates have been suppressed for so long, and even the short-term market tightening that Drew mentioned earlier, I think a lot of companies are in a bad financial situation, and you may start to see that snowball effect take place of more and more companies leaving the industry. And I really believe, outside of like a major like catalyst to drive demand, that the exiting of supply will ultimately be what, shifts the market back to not to what we saw during COVID, but to more of the historic, peaks and valleys that we've experienced. The COVID days are behind us from my point of view, but doesn't take too much supply leaving the market and a little bit of uptick in demand to really, create some market constraints. And I think we saw it this year for the first time in 2 years with produce season. This was the first produce season the industry has really experienced in the last 2 years, both from a tonnage standpoint, but also how it's impacted capacity and pricing to some extent. And so I think it's a glimpse of what could happen if enough supply leaves and demand upticks a little bit. So I still think we're a little bit away from that shift really taking place. But, to Andrew's point, this time next year, I would expect to be a bit more carrier and broker friendly than the last 26 months have been.
Are we back to, are we sitting at $3 a mile produce loads out of Florida and Georgia right now? Is that where we're at?
I wouldn't say they've jumped to that height, but you definitely, you definitely are seeing some rains this year, though, I would say.
Yeah. One thing I think we talk about too is we talk about, supply and we talk about carriers, right? I think we got to look at the supply of brokers too, right? Of how many came into the market. And, the one thing I keep thinking about, and Jay, I hope this comes off the right way, I hear everybody always say pre-pandemic. It was 4 freaking years ago, right? Like things have changed in 4 years, guys. Right? People have grown in 4 years, right? And I hear from everybody, hey, is it going to get back to pre-pandemic number? It's 4 years ago. This isn't a year or two like it was in 21 or 22, right? We're in 2024 now. Now, do I think we get back to some more normal cycles from a spot perspective? I do, right? When you look at some of the things that all of us look at from these curves that we have, and obviously our beyond curve that we put out there. I'll do my plug here as well, Blair. But I think when you look at the year-over-year, quarter-over-quarter perspective in COVID, spot got up to 60%. When you look at historically, that's usually somewhere around that 40%, 35%, somewhere in there. And I think we get back to those kind of normal cycles that we saw before on things like that.
So
yeah, the other interesting thing, like in whether or not we want to get into this or not, but and I'll bring up pandemic time as well, is we had partially shippers starting to invest in their own assets, right? Cost control, cost volatility, certainty within there. So it's curious whether or not that capacity shift has gone more in the private fleet realm. And then you have the other side of it when we're talking about owner operators and driver dispatchers overall, who really were able to accelerate their earnings during the pandemic time. Is that nest egg perhaps running out with some of the the market that we've been in for what feels like some time now? So really, those are interesting discussion points to bring up and really understand how that's impacting the mention of revocations of authority and how that's kind of transitioned from that owner operator over to private fleets, so on and so forth there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is, and this is completely conjecture, I guess it's just what I'm thinking in my head, but that I think about shippers that are getting their own private fleets. I feel like that decision process is way slower than if a normal trucking company were to want to buy trucks, because it's like just not their bread and butter, and it just takes a lot longer for them to get to a place where like, yeah, we're gonna operate our own fleet. I think it's one thing if you're going from 200 trucks to 300, but to be someone, like I remember hearing Home Depot maybe was going to buy their own boat a few years ago. I don't know if that ended up happening. That was when but in any case, I think it's an interesting point. I'm not sure if the impact would be substantial enough in the time period. But it's something to think about for sure.
Well, your whole landscape changes too. You buy one truck. I mean, all of us know this in our seats. Your whole liability, your insurance, everything that you look at, workman's comp, things like that. I mean, the whole ball game changes for you all overnight, right? Because, Jay, Blair, I'm sure your guys ask you all the time, hey, when are we going to get a couple trucks, or when are we going to look at it this way? We can go out there and sell as an asset and a broker together. That really changes your whole landscape of the company going forward.
And it's a great point, Andrew. And when you think about it too, is talk about orders, from the OEMs and during the pandemic and how long that took to cycle. Some are still waiting for some of those orders, if they were at scale to come through overall. So you bring up a great point in just thinking through again how capacity is either being added or exiting, across the marketplace overall.
And I'm curious now, like from what I've heard, again, I haven't been the one operating a brokerage, but the rate adjustments, the bid cycles have been shortened in a lot of cases and are more frequent. Or maybe it's not shortened, maybe it's committed for a year and 3 or 4 or 6 months later, they're saying we got to rebid. What do we think it looks like when the market turns? Are brokers going to hold their rates, or is this going to be, a likely quick, hey, listen, I got my ass kicked the last 2 years. I'm not, the market has shifted in the last 3 weeks. I'm not losing 20 cents a mile on this. You got to pay me more. Is that likely where we get back to?
I think that, I think to one comment you made, like we're definitely seeing much more frequent bid cycles. The annual RFP season being between September and December is kind of, I don't want to say an archaic way, but it's certainly not the way many shippers operate. Many are running these quarterly, biannual bids. And I think that trend will likely stick for a while. I think it's in many ways in all parties' best interest to be in that position to rebid on a more regular basis. I think that, just reading the tea leaves, that the large asset-based trucking companies will be the first ones to go back to shippers and say, we can't operate at these rates. I think we're already starting to hear some of that commentary in some of the quarterly earnings that have happened in the last 2 quarters. They control a lot of the capacity on the road, especially for the Fortune 1000 shipper base. I suspect they'll be the first to act. It's just my guess.
Jay, it's a great call, and the big assets are our best friend through this as well too. They'll start to park the trucks; they dictate the market, right? And I think about what you say about the process. I'll give you an example. 3 years ago, one of our largest shippers took about a month and a half to get through that RFP process, from the day they sent it out to going through the bids, getting them all uploaded, going through that. That same shipper now turned around their annual bid in 3 days. Right? Because of the technology, the way that they're looking at things, the systems that they're using today. And so I think the shipper side's really catching up on this as well, too, because they saw the little amount of technology they were able to put into it was able to capture so much cost savings on the back end of things.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Uncertainty, cost volatility. I mean, that's where we're seeing, more of those quarterly bids that are being put out there. Andrew, I'll put it out to you. I know you were vocal during, your time at your company about really, sticking to your rates even through some of those difficult market cycles. What was the reaction? How did that ultimately play out for you?
It's a great question. So I think that on one side, there were a lot of shippers that respected and appreciated it. I mean, our 2020, August and September of 2020 were 2 of the most challenging months of my life, as our gross margin was comparable to a good old digital freight broker. I'm just kidding. It was low. I mean, it was low single digits, and it was intentional. I don't know if it was necessary. I think our shippers would have understood rate adjustments, but that's how we wanted to stand out. And a lot of our shippers reciprocated that in the following year, and we saw big growth and no adjustments on our rates. But it wasn't true of everyone. And there were a lot of companies that, when push come to shove, they may have really respected us and appreciated the hell out of us, but they had a job and they had a boss, and their boss told them to get the savings. And so they couldn't just let us stay 20% above market on a $5 or $10 million award. It wasn't feasible for their job. And so I think it became a buy customer situation where, initially it was a en masse, we are committed to this concept. And then once we were burned by enough, it was like, okay, let's let you make the rules, shipper. Like, if it's your game, you're in charge. You tell me how we're going to play. If every 3 months or every 6 months, we're going to change the rates because the market's changing, I'm in. I'll play that. If you want me to stand by my rates for the year, my expectation is the next year you're going to stand by yours. And if not, that's the challenging thing is like, if you want to build trust in brokerage, you have to kind of take that first step, and you can be burned by the carrier or the customer or both. And all you can really do is say, you know what? I learned my lesson. I'm not going to work with that carrier anymore. I'm not going to work with that customer the way I was working with them. I'll reduce my acceptance percentage to what the market is at, or my on top, whatever it is. So, you know, we didn't solve something like across the board. I think we built some really strong relationships that should last hopefully decades there, even without me and other people there. But, it was a lesson for sure. And there were adjustments that needed to be made after the fact. With that,
he put you on the hot seat.
I love being on the hot seat. I mean, what I've noticed about this episode is I've kind of been able to just chill because you three are doing most of the talking. I can just ask the questions. A lot of time, if it's just me and one other person, I feel like I should be inputting a lot of my own opinions, but you guys got enough of your own great opinions. I was going to say crappy because I was feeling like it, but no, I'm just kidding. In any case, we're going to wrap with this. Last question. I want a bold prediction from each of you. Something, it could be anything related to the industry over the next 5-10 years. Give me something juicy, something interesting, something I can market. No, it doesn't need to be marketable, but just give me a juicy prediction, something that you think is going to happen that could change things for us.
I'll start. I said the one kind of earlier. I think the short-term thing that could be a big change in this industry would be the speed limit thing. I really do believe, guys, that would be a shakeup that would really change things in a different format. I think a bigger, bolder prediction 5-10 years out, how this looks like. I think two things. I think one, spot freight isn't anything what it looks like today, right? It's a whole different ballgame about how you look at that. And I think the second thing you think about.
Can you elaborate? First, when you say that spot freight, you mean like, spot freight of juicy margins is not a thing anymore? Or what do you mean? Just less of it?
It's just a competitive, just from a technology perspective. I think your small shipper will always kind of be the way that the small shipper is. The mid-size to large shipper will have access to technology to be able to move quicker through the spot market, get things to more contract. I think you're just going to see a more of a digital approach to keep on going on that aspect of it. I think the second bigger thing, and more probably to your point on like the 5-10 year thing, so bold statement, 19,000, 20,000 brokers, whatever you look at out there, you're going to see a huge consolidation. I think in the next 5-10 years. I don't want to go this far, but when you think about some of the stock brokers and how those exchanges were back in the day, to getting to Robinhood and E-Trade and things like that, and having big platforms, I could see that being the big consolidation in the next 5-10 years.
I'll say this. I think that, and I'm going to start by going back in time. I think if you went back in time almost 10 years ago now, we're all told the digital freight, the pure play digital freight brokers are going to take over the industry. I think, which clearly hasn't taken place. I think if you fast forward 5 or 10 years, the universal belief is going to be the 3PLs that have a proper balance of technology and relationships is the winning model in our space. And so I think you're going to see more of these pure play, venture-backed digital brokers go under, get acquired, and it's going to be the large legacy brokers that have a appreciation for technology that are going to drive the consolidation of the industry and also take more market share as we look into the future. That to me is the winning formula. And I think we're seeing it, play out with some of the exits that have occurred over the last 18 months. So not saying technology isn't a big part of our business, but I think the digital broker as a standalone business concept is not going to be something that's talked about the way it's been talked about the last 10 years.
I think a potential big bold bet would be a resurgence within, self-driving overall. I know that was a reasonably big phrase, a handful of years ago. I think that there has to be something where you're, I'll go back to kind of that co-pilot model. We're not, I don't think we're in a situation where that's going to be fully automated or self-driving overall. I think there's going to have to be a middle ground that's figured out there. I think also when you think about electrification overall and what that means within that space, I think that's potentially something that's gonna or we're gonna see something be played out there in the next handful of years.
Awesome. I love it. So with that, we're gonna wrap. Go ahead.
What's yours?
What's mine?
Freight Prodigy. I got to hear from the Freight Prodigy.
Oh, I thought we lost that nickname. Nolan.
Before we get low.
Okay, what's my big bold? Okay, carrier reps will be a dime a dozen in 5 years. I think that companies that have 500 today will have 100 in 5 years. I think that's a relationship management piece is what it's going to be. I think that whole function of carrier procurement is that we grew up in is a thing of the past. I don't know. I kind of think the AI thing is gonna be big in how that plays on the carrier side. I think there's still gonna be a need for strong relationships with the carriers, and I just think it's gonna look really, really different on that side. I think the customer side's not gonna be that different. I think the ops, customer operations, scheduling, in 5 years there will not be a human scheduling appointments. So I think those are things that are going to change a lot. And, I don't know what that looks like for, I think that doesn't mean brokerages are going anywhere. I think brokerages, like you said, I think consolidation is probably coming. I'm hopeful there's a way for the little guy to still exist. When I started Molo, my dad said, he's like, you shouldn't do it in 5 years. There's only going to be like 5 big brokers and that's it. So, I mean, he was off, and that was 2017. That would have been 2 years ago. We could be wrong about it again. I mean, I don't know, but I could see why the industry would start to consolidate. It just feels like the tech is finally starting to make some hay there. So that's my bold prediction. I'm part of me hopes I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't have a dog in the fight. I love carrier reps and I love the role, and I just think you're going to be able to do more with less. So with that, we're going to call it. This was a great episode. I appreciate all three of you coming on. I'm hopeful that this worked. I don't know. For our audience, hopefully will be completely unaware of the technological issues that we had today. This was the most I've ever had. It's also the first time I've tried to do this kind of thing with 3 people, other than the convoy episode the one time. But you guys have been great sports, and I appreciate you putting up with me and coming on and sharing your thoughts. And to our audience, I hope you enjoyed it. We'll do more of this, and we'll see you on the next episode. Have a good one.